Hey everyone, welcome to a special legal news version of the Dan and Joe Sports Show Locker Room Talk. As always, I'm Dan.
And I'm Joe.
Hey Joe, we have some really fascinating legal stories going on in college football right now. And as both of us are attorneys, I just thought it would be really fun to talk about these three big issues. And of course, the ones that I'm referring to, the Mel Tucker story, whether or not you wanted to hear it, you have heard about it. The Tez Walker story, just a really sad another version of the NCAA being obstinate over stupid issues, and then the Oregon State and Washington State story, which I find to be just really uplifting and a great story of David versus Goliath, and maybe David actually winning in a circumstance where it really did seem like there was no way that they had any chance but to be relegated. And of course, our locker room talk is always brought to you by fine sponsors. Beach ball properties. They're really blowing up there over in Baldwin County. If you're looking for a beach house rental or a condo in Orange Beach or Gulf Shores, the weather is fantastic right now. It's been in the 70s and 80s, but the water is still warm enough to go swim. Go give Hunter and Ginger Harrelson a call at Beach Ball Properties and go have a ball at the beach.
Sounds good.
And Joe, with what we've been having, I think it's time for some ball talk.
Yeah,
Uh,
definitely.
and Joe, first off, let's start with Mel Tucker. This has got to be one of the most dumbest, just like I just can't even understand it stories I've ever read in my entire life. Joe, first off, this thing begins with a dumb action, and that is paying this guy this insane contract. When I mean, at the time he was unproven. I mean, we can all agree on this. He gets one victory over Michigan, and anyone that watched that game, there was a lot of questionable calls by the officials in that game. Um, I can remember being like, wow, if I was a Michigan fan, I would be furious about what happened in this game. But he wins this game, and they have a great season, mostly because Kenneth Walker was just a bad man, just an incredible running back that year. One that I knew would be excellent in the pros, and he's proven to be so. And so, Mel Tucker gets this incredible deal. I mean, what was it? It was a $90 million deal for 10 years, and he's been there in his second season. His first season, I don't even think he made a bowl game. Like, what was it? You and I were joking about this on the show. It was like 7 hours after the ink dried on this contract. Ohio State went out and whipped them like 56-7 and finished the season pretty strong. But last year they were terrible. And so he's got this contract of which I believe 70 million is guaranteed. So I mean, he basically, Joe, he had it coach idiot proof. Like, didn't matter what he did. I mean, as long as he wasn't doing anything immoral or unbecoming to being a coach and serving in a righteous manner, he could go out there and lose every game for the next 2 years, and Michigan State have to pony up $70 million. What does he do?
Yeah, it definitely takes away that motivational factor. And I think you're right that it was definitely an overreaction to Kenneth Walker's brilliance. And it wasn't really looking at the full scope of what Mel Tucker was going to bring to the table.
Absolutely, Joe. You know what this would have been like? This would have been like if Auburn, when Brian Harsin went into Death Valley and him and Bo Nix won that game against LSU, where Auburn hadn't won in 22 years, which interestingly enough, we're going to talk about it in our recap show. Tennessee now has the same level, same amount of years. The next time they go to Florida in the swamp, they'll have lost 22 years in a row down there, as Auburn did at LSU. When Bo Nix had that magical game and beat LSU in Brian Harsin's first year, that would have been like if Auburn after that game was like, "Oh, Brian Harsin, thank you so much for ending this awful streak we've had in Baton Rouge. Here's a $90 million guaranteed contract." That would have been that level of an overreaction.
Yeah, it's the same parallel with what Michigan State did here.
That's right. So they give Mel Tucker this incredible sweetheart deal. Next year, pretty poor. Then he has this woman, Miss Tracy, who sadly was a sexual assault victim when she was at Oregon State. And I think it involved a sexual assault with multiple football players at once. And she's turned this really awful event in her life into a huge positive. I mean, she's a speaker that talks about sexual assault and the effect it had on her. And I think, how to avoid situations where it happens. You know, she talks to football teams and athletic, you know, teams. I think survivors also kind of attacks it from both sides. I think a really great use of a terrible thing that's happened to you. I don't think anyone can disagree with that, and I think that's a cool story. So that's the person that's at the center of all this. And so, you know, it depends on who you hear from. The basic facts are the same. Everyone knows what Mel Tucker did when he was on the phone, and he doesn't dispute that. It's a question of whether it's consensual or not, and that's all well and good. But here's the deal, and I think that Michigan State has a great basis for firing him for cause, whether or not it was consensual. You know, my mind is I tend to believe her in this because I don't see why she would want to put her reputation on the line for something like this. Don't you think so, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like somebody that would have a lot of credibility to believe her here. And I just feel like there aren't many examples where something like this, comes out and it's not really problematic. And so, yeah, I definitely side with you that Michigan State needs to enforce that clause. And I don't think they need to give in very, very easily.
No, and here's the deal also, Joe. I mean, let's say that Mel Tucker is being truthful. Now, this was a consensual thing, and maybe she got mad at him for some reason or the other, and that's why this was leaked out there. Okay, let's say Mel Tucker is telling the truth. It still exhibits incredibly poor judgment, and he should have known that. I mean, you can't do anything when you're that high profile, and especially in a situation like this, and not expect something to happen. And therefore, you should have known it would be embarrassing for your university. Shows very poor judgment, and probably is going to fit within the morality clause because he was married at the time. And so I don't know that changes anything, especially if you're Michigan State. And I think especially when you consider everything that's happened in Michigan State, from the Larry Nassar awfulness, the gymnastics trainer, to the school shooting that they had really recently, and the fact that there was a cover up to an extent with the Nassar situation, that I just don't think that you can afford to either pay him his money or reach a settlement, because guess what? I think if you don't go all the way with this, people are going to know you settled with them, and people are going to think less of you because of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely fully agree with that. I think that Michigan State has to be bold here. If you're not going to be bold in this type of situation, what in the world is that clause in the contract for to begin with? And your attorneys are just not doing their job for you, in my opinion. And so I definitely think you got to enforce this. And I think that you would lose a lot of clout, and your reputation just gets worse as a university unless you hold him to that contract.
Absolutely, man. This is a university that has a great athletics program in multiple sports. I mean, football, they got a great history. Basketball, they have a better history. It's a good academic institution. You and I knew a bunch of people that we went to law school with that went there, or that affiliate themselves as Michigan State people. And they've had a lot of things that were embarrassed them. And I feel like they've made the right move now to choose to terminate him. And now they need to just go ahead and go all the way with it and preserve, I think, the reputation of the university, because this is a bad story for him. And I think you need to stick up for Sparty on this.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
All right, Joe, now we move on to Tez Walker, which may be an even more upsetting story, especially if you're someone that has had a lot of questions about what's going on in the NCAA. All right, Joe, Tez Walker, he's a receiver that is currently in North Carolina Tar Heel. Had a really, kind of tumultuous pathway through college, and one that I think is upsetting. We're almost past this COVID era of players, but there's still a whole lot of players out there who were affected by COVID in terms of their collegiate experience in athletics. And Tez Walker, he goes to North Carolina Central, which is an HBCU. And I think just about every HBCU and most D2 programs, because of COVID-19, they went ahead and canceled their season in 2020. And they also a lot of them canceled their spring season. And so North Carolina Central cancels their fall season in 2020 and their spring season in 2021. And that's the year that Tez Walker enrolls there. He leaves and goes to Kent State, never having played it down at North Carolina Central because they didn't have any season. He plays for Kent State for 2 seasons, does excellent, And his grandma gets really sick back in North Carolina, and I believe she lives somewhere within an hour or so of Chapel Hill. He's able to parlay the great receiving records that he set at Kent State into getting a scholarship offer to play with Mac Brown in North Carolina. He transfers there, and about a month or so after he makes this transfer, they institute the rule in the NCAA that you can only have one free transfer, otherwise you have to sit a year. So he does this before they even institute the rule. And now the NCAA has not let him play a single down for North Carolina this year. And he's having to serve a 1 year, essentially a 1 year suspension where he has to sit out the entire season. And to me, it's incredibly unfair on multiple levels. So first level is that, he didn't get to play, right? It's really like he's only transferred once because he never played it down in North Carolina Central. And Joe, going to something that you and I both had experience with, and that it's a great defense, I think, on anything. This is the NCAA performing what's called an ex post facto law. They're enforcing a law against him that when he made the decision to transfer didn't apply to him. And I think that's the biggest thing about why this is a really upsetting and I think potentially cataclysmic decision by the NCAA to not let him play.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And I completely concur with that assessment. And I think the narrative I've always had on this show with the NCAA is that the only thing consistent about their rulings is their mark of inconsistency. And I see in this day and age so many waivers that are granted. I pretty much reached the conclusion where getting a waiver was almost like a rite of passage. And so for him to be denied at all, especially under the circumstances, to me is entirely frustrating.
And what's interesting to me is the NCAA has had this shocked response to it. Like, well, all the coaches and the presidents wanted us to have this, only one free transfer rule, and y'all are really getting upset at us about it. Well, yes, it should be a case-by-case decision. And on this one, you're enforcing it against someone who the rule didn't apply to when he made the decision. And that's what makes it even worse. And I mean, I just don't understand it. And I think it's such a terrible look for the NCAA. And this is one that I think really is backfiring on him. And Mac Brown has been extremely vocal in his disappointment with the NCAA and really his disgust in their decision.
Right. And then lastly, I would like to kind of monitor over the next year or two. We're going to see, still more players who will be impacted by COVID because I guess we're now, if you were a freshman in 2020, you're maybe a senior. And so we're still going to see another year or two of some of these transfers being a little bit more common. And so I'll be interested to see kind of how this applies to a case study and if we see other waivers that are granted in similar situations versus not granted.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem the NCAA has dug for themselves now is that Tez Walker and then his really successful attorney, Thomas Morris, who's been just slaying the NCAA left and right, they're going to watch them to see which ones they grant. And I almost feel like if you're the NCAA now, you've put yourself in a situation where you have to deny every single one of these to be consistent.
This would be the worst time to be asking for a waiver.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think this is yet again, like as you put very eloquently, consistently inconsistent by the NCAA and just further tarnishing the reputation.
Yep, it is.
And, I would love to see it, and it may happen that maybe North Carolina just, sticks it to him and just plays him at some point this season. I mean, they've got such little power right now. So it might be time for somebody to do something like that.
No, I love the concept of that. I want to see somebody in an NCAA T-shirt having to run on the field to get him off the field.
Yeah, just trying to drag him off.
Yeah, trying to tackle him, get him off the field.
All right, Joe. Speaking of taking down the establishment and the little guy, this next one is probably my favorite of these three. And now we're talking about Oregon State and Washington State versus George Kliavkoff and the Pac-12. All right, Joe. Oregon State and Washington State are the two teams that have been jettisoned. They're the ones that have been almost like Premier League relegated in all of this ridiculous conference realignment that we've had. Sad part about it, they both have had, I would say, solid football programs. I'm not going to sit here and say they're blue bloods or they're great football programs, but they've both made Rose Bowls. They've both had teams that finished in the top five. I mean, you think about Washington State with Ryan Leaf almost winning a national championship in the 90s, playing in a Rose Bowl. Oregon State with Chad Johnson / Chad Ochocinco having that incredible 11-1 season. Oregon State is pretty conservative, consistently good. There's a lot of seasons they go win 8-9 games, sometimes 10 games. Last year they were very good. Washington State, I mean, when they had Mike Leach, they had gotten to a point where they won 10 games a couple years in a row. Problem they have is the only thing that matters now, Joe, is TV revenue and TV viewership. And both of them are small universities, not anywhere near big markets. And the markets that they are close to have already been absorbed within Oregon and Washington. And that's why the Pac-12, that's why the Big Ten didn't want them. That's why the ACC doesn't want them. They just don't bring a lot to the table when it comes to that. But in terms of athletic programs, they're perfectly great, and I like them. And you think about Oregon State, I mean, they're, I would say, a top 5 college baseball program, right?
Yeah, they're the like the Mississippi State of the Pac-12, like great baseball program. You know, football has its days. You think about Dak Prescott with State, and then I look at Washington State. I would equate them to kind of like an Arkansas. You know, like the football is steady. The basketball has had like some tradition. You know, Tony Bennett was at Washington State before he went to Virginia, and so you've got some basketball excitement. So I feel like, you know, both of those programs have their place. They just don't bring about the excitement of maybe the upper echelon.
Right. And so what they've done is, you know, everybody's been talking about, are they going to merge with the Mountain West? Maybe try and maintain that whole Pac-12 logo and identity, a conference that has existed for over 100 years. Well, all of these schools have left the Pac-12, and in the charter of the Pac-12, it says if you leave the conference, you can no longer be a voting member. So while they're trying to make plans for the last year of the Pac-12, think about revenue distribution, and especially now them having 8 teams in the top 25, thinking about, whoa, if we can get college football playoff money, what we're going to do with it. Oregon State and Washington State very definitely have filed an injunction against them to make sure they can't have a meeting and they can't have a vote on any of this, with the idea, hopefully, that if they get a team in the college football playoff, all that money is going to them for them to restart a new conference or go off on their own, whatever. And step one in the Washington Superior Court, it got granted. And I'm just loving to see what happens next on this, because I'm really rooting for both of them.
No doubt. Like, I love them turning the tables on, you know, all the teams that basically have prevented their conference's permanent existence. And I think it's just a great story. And I would love nothing better to see, you know, to see them be successful with the suit.
That's right. And I would love nothing more to see y'all in our next episode. I want to thank everybody for listening. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, catch us on live in living color. And of course, follow us on Twitter at DJ Sports Show, and listen to us on Spotify, the Dan Joe Sports Show. And as always, I'm Dan.
And I'm Joe.